To the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, the government certainly hasn't been in a hurry to pass this bill. It was introduced 3¼ years ago, and in fact it went through the Select Committee process very rapidly indeed. It was reported back to the House November 2009. So for over 3 years this bill has languished on the order paper. And the government really needs to look at how it's managing its legislative agenda when it can't pass legislation that sends an important signal, because New Zealand is, as the Minister acclaimed, seen as a leading country in terms of environmental protection in Antarctica. Every party in the House will support this piece of legislation, but for some reason, Minister, it has sat on the order paper for 3 years and no explanation was offered by the Minister as to why that should be the case. Labor supported the introduction of this bill, it supported its passage through the Select Committee, and it will be supporting the passage of the bill into law through its remaining stages today. The bill amends the Antarctic Environmental Protection Act 1994. It does so to implement New Zealand's obligations under Annex 6 to the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty on liability arising from environmental emergencies. The origin of this particular protocol was back in Labor's time in 2005, when the 28th Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting adopted an annex dealing with environmental emergencies occurring in Antarctic. Quite a number of members of this House will have visited the Antarctic. Everyone that has been down there would have just been absolutely amazed at the pristine nature of an environment that is incredibly fragile, incredibly important to the world. And it is right that New Zealand, with its activities at Scott Base and the Ross Sea area, should be a leading country promoting the protection of the Antarctic environment. Back in 1959, New Zealand was very proudly one of the original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about this because it was a remarkable treaty for the time. Just think back to 1959, Mr Speaker, when the world was in the middle of a Cold War. It was at the worst stages of the antagonism between the Soviet bloc and the United States and the countries aligned to it. This treaty declared that Antarctic shall be used for peaceful purposes only. That was the guiding principle of the treaty. It prohibited the establishment of military bases in the Antarctic. It prohibited the testing of weapons there, and it prohibited the dumping of any nuclear waste in the territory. It was a proud moment for the world. It showed, actually, in the midst of the Cold War, how you could establish a model for international cooperation. In 1991, there was a further major milestone achieved. It was the Protocol on Environmental Protection, a protocol to the treaty that was concluded in Madrid in that year. That provided for comprehensive protection of the environment in the Antarctic. It set aside the Antarctic as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And that also, building on the original 1959 treaty, was a major milestone. The Liability Annex that we are debating today in the House was adopted in 2005. It sets out the rules and procedures relating to liability for damage that arises from activities taking place there. We played a leading role at the time that I was Minister in the negotiation of that Liability Annex. In fact, New Zealand was the chair of the negotiations. This bill implements the obligations that we signed up to in those negotiations. It requires operators, that is those who are conducting or organising Antarctic activities, to take prompt, effective action when environmental emergencies arise from their activities. The New Zealand operators must notify the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade if they cause or if they discover an environmental emergency. If an operator fails to take prompt, effective response action, the Annex party may do so, and the defaulting operator must reimburse the costs to the Annex party. The High Court is empowered to order the operator to pay an amount representing the costs that were incurred. This is paid into an Environmental Protection Fund administered by the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat. Failure to notify appropriate authorities or to take prompt and effective action has sanctions that are set out with terms of imprisonment, I think up to 2 years, and or a fine. I've got to say, Mr Speaker, that those sanctions are not going to be the most effective deterrent. The most effective deterrent will be the reputation of the operator, because the wrath of the world will descend on anybody that desecrates an environment as important and fragile as that in the Antarctica. The bill sets out situations in which an operator is exempt from liability, and it also imposes a financial limit on liability for emergencies involving a ship. That's the equivalent of US dollars 1.5 million, and for other environmental emergencies 4.5 million US dollars. This bill is a positive step, though it's not sufficient in itself to protect the pristine natural environment of Antarctica, which could be threatened, for example, by oil spills from the increasing number of tourist ships that visit the region, or indeed from fishing vessels. We've entered into an obligation to implement the Liability Annex, and it's actually past time for us to finally do so. As I mentioned in introducing my comments, this bill is now 3¼ years old. It was introduced a long time ago. It passed quickly through the Select Committee. Maybe the next speaker from the National Party side can explain why it has sat, it's languished on the order paper and not progressed, because I can see no reason why that should have been the case. Mr Speaker, actually the Labor government, as Paul Hutchison so nobly admits, was very active in passing legislation. It got legislation through, and actually it was the party that organised, that led the negotiations for the very important annex that we are recognising today in this legislation to actually pass through. The Antarctic environment is vulnerable, it is fragile, and it's the more so because actually there's an increasing number of visitors going to Antarctica, something in excess of 50,000 a year. That creates real threats to an environment that is fragile as the ice sheet down there is. It's also becoming a magnet in terms of a much larger number of countries wanting to establish permanent presence there. We should be leading by example, and the delay in passing this legislation is not leading by example. We need the treaty to be ratified by all of the consultative parties, and we should be leading the way so that this annex comes into effect as quickly as possible. Mr Speaker, Parliament can and should remedy the long delay in passing this legislation by putting it through its remaining second and third readings today. I welcome the legislation, and I welcome the signal that it sends that New Zealand continues to take very seriously its obligations in the Antarctic, and in particular in relation to the protection of the environment there.
Call John Hayes.